Herzlich willkommen heute zurück bei Lernen in der Zukunft. Und heute habe ich die große Freude, mit Stanford zu sprechen, nämlich mit der weltweiten Dopaminexpertin. Dr. Lembke ist heute mein Gast. Sie hat ein Buch geschrieben über Dopamin, die Dopaminnation. Und da werden wir heute darüber sprechen, was Dopamin mit uns macht und was wir tun können, um unser Dopaminsystem auch wieder unter Kontrolle zu kriegen. A heart warm welcome to Stanford, Dr. Anna Lembke. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to me. And when I was talking to my friends and my colleagues about dopamine, and that an expert on dopamine will join me, they came up with lots of questions. But what is dopamine? Because we always think about it being a happy hormone, so that serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine. What is the main role? Is it the motivating hormone, or what is it?
Yeah, so I think, when I think about dopamine, it's the chemical in the brain that makes sure we're paying a lot of attention to what is happening around us. And it's the chemical that signals to us whether we should approach something or whether we should avoid it, back off and avoid it. So an easy way to talk about that is that dopamine is the pleasure hormone, because it's the neurotransmitter that tells us to approach something, that this is something that we need to investigate or get more of. So dopamine is really fundamental to getting us to approach a potential rewarding substance or behavior.
And what's the role of adrenaline then? Isn't that also part of when we should focus on something?
Well, sure. I mean, there are lots of different chemicals in the brain that.
And how do you measure all of that? Because I think it's always got to be some kind of mixture.
Yes, it's always going to be a mixture, but adrenaline is really more like an alarm system telling us that this is something that we need to worry about. Adrenaline is the fight, flight, or freeze kind of chemical, whereas dopamine is really central to pleasure, motivation, and reward. Now, dopamine's not the only neurotransmitter that's involved in that process, but it is.
Are the others?
Well, you've got serotonin, you've got norepinephrine, you've got oxytocin, you've got the whole endo-opioid system, the cannabinoid system. So there are lots of different systems, but dopamine probably is the final common pathway for all reinforcing and addictive substances and behaviors. And when we become addicted, dopamine is one of the main neurotransmitters that goes awry or gets out of balance.
So is dopamine always the most important chemical when it comes to addiction? Because I know you wrote a book about the opioid crisis before this book, or prior to this book. Is this so if I'm addicted to whatever, is it always dopamine?
So that's a good question. The reason that various substances that occur in nature or that we have created through technology are addictive is because they mimic a chemical that our own brain makes. So our brain makes its own endogenous cannabis. We make our own endogenous opioids. We make our own version of stimulants, norepinephrine. We have nicotinic receptors. So all of those substances that we ingest that are reinforcing are very potent versions of the chemicals that we make ourselves. Mm-hmm. But the final common pathway for all of those different substances is to release dopamine, this neurotransmitter, in a very specific circuit of the brain called the reward circuit. So dopamine is sort of like the common currency for all these different reinforcing drugs and behaviors.
Are there ways to naturally um, um, release these substances in our brains without external substances? So kind of like maybe a self-hypnosis thing. So now I don't need to smoke some weed or so, and just mind think. This is another question that came up.
Yeah.
This would have the positives without the negatives. Is there a possibility for that?
Well, there's no entirely free lunch. When it comes to dopamine, either you have to pay up front or you have to pay afterwards. Mm-hmm. What intoxicants or addictive drugs and addictive behaviors like gambling, pornography, social media, video games, they all release a lot of dopamine all at once. And that's why they feel good. But what happens is, as soon as that dopamine is increased above baseline levels, the body responds by downregulating our own dopamine production and our own dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. And that's the dopamine deficit state. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect. So we have to
is it
really
that we produce less dopamine, or is it that we have more receptors afterwards? Because I heard one theory is that if you have if you take drugs or something like that, more dopamine receptors are produced, and that is why afterwards it's not so intense anymore.
Yeah. So maybe I should start at the beginning to
you could, and you could also show you brought some pictures if you want to. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let me show that. Okay, so this is a cartoon drawing of the brain, and this is the reward circuit. It consists of the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, and the prefrontal cortex. And this circuit has been conserved across millions of years of evolution and across species, and it's the fundamental circuit that allows us to experience pleasure, motivation, and reward. Dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter that functions in this circuit. And just to briefly explain what neurotransmitters are, they're the molecules that bridge the gap between neurons. So this is a presynaptic neuron that sends an electrical impulse to a postsynaptic neuron, which then transmits that impulse. But there's a little space between neurons called the synapse. Mm-hmm. And that's a way to fine tune the electrical circuit, and to make sure that we don't have sort of runaway circuits, which is essentially a seizure. And the way we do that is through neurotransmitters, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's released by the presynaptic neuron and binds to the postsynaptic neuron and then sends the signal. You can kind of think of that like a pitcher releasing a ball, which is the dopamine, and then the catcher catching it in their catcher's mitt, which is like the postsynaptic neuronal receptor. So what we know from animal experiments is that reinforcing drugs and behaviors release more dopamine temporarily in that reward circuit. And you can see here that different types of substances and behaviors release different amounts of dopamine above baseline level. So we have a tonic baseline level of dopamine firing. And when we do something that's reinforcing or ingest something that's reinforcing, we have a temporary increase in dopamine firing. And you can see here some examples. I think what's important to keep in mind, though, that we all have a different drug of choice. So there's enormous inter-individual variability. For me, sex might, increase my dopamine firing 100%, but for you, it might be more than that or less than that, and vice versa, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We wouldn't want, everybody going for the same reward. In a tribe, you would want people going for different rewards so that collectively as a group, we have everything that we need. Dopamine is also very important to movement. So even the most primitive worm will release dopamine in response to food in the area. And of course, your listeners probably know that dopamine is, for example, gets depleted in a disease called Parkinson's disease, right?
Yeah.
And it's no coincidence probably that dopamine is important, not just for movement, but also for reward and motivation, because, in nature, we typically have to move to go get our reward. Of course, that's different now. We can just sit on our couch and get our reward, but that's part of the problem that I'll talk about. So how do we process pleasure and pain? Well, one of the most interesting findings is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. And this is a relatively new finding in neuroscience in the last 75 years. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we do something that's reinforcing, our balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But there are certain rules governing this balance. And one of the overarching rules is that the balance wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tilted very long to the side of pleasure or pain. So as soon as we deviate from the neutral position, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And they do that by adapting to the increased dopamine, by down-regulating dopamine receptors and dopamine transmission. I like to think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the come down, the after effect, the dopamine deficit state that follows that dopamine increase. Now, after a few moments or a few hours or a few days, depending on the drug and how much we took, eventually those gremlins hop off and homeostasis, or a level balance, is restored. But of course, while we're in this dopamine deficit state, the natural inclination is to want to reach for the drug again in order to get that good feeling. Now, in a world of scarcity, right, which is the world that humans have evolved in for millions of years, you run out very quickly of your drug. And so you reach for it and there's none there. And not only that, you have to work very hard and walk tens of kilometers to find that another berry bush or another oasis or a bison or whatever it is, a mate, a partner that you're looking for. But the problem is that in the modern ecosystem, we have engineered highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors that are now available at the touch of a fingertip. And that gets us to the second rule of the balance, which is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar rewarding stimulus, that initial response to the pleasure side gets weaker and shorter, and that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. And one of the ways to depict that is to just say that if we continue to bombard our reward pathway with reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we accumulate more and more gremlins on the pain side of the balance, and ultimately they're camped out there and they're not going away soon. And now what we've done is we've reset our pleasure set point, or what we call our hedonic set point. Now we need to use our drug not to feel good.
I love the barbecuing one.
Yeah, you like that? Yeah. Now we need our drug not to feel good, but just now we need a whole lot of drug, right? Just to reassert a level balance. And when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. And you can see this poor guy here is certainly in that state. So I don't know if you want me to go on. Here's actually a nice, this is from Nora Volkoff and her team showing this using brain imaging. So red symbolizes healthy dopamine transmission. And what you see here on the left is these are the brains of people who are not addicted to drugs. And there's plenty of red in the nucleus accumbens, which is part of that reward circuitry. They have healthy dopamine transmission. But here you see people who have been addicted to drugs, to cocaine, to methamphetamine, to alcohol, to heroin. And importantly, these are individuals who stopped using their drug 2 weeks prior. So even 2 weeks after stopping using their drug, they're still in a dopamine deficit state, right? They're still walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain. And that's why people relapse. Even though like everyone will say, well, you're doing so much better, your life is so much better, but their brain isn't necessarily better, right? And that's what kind of drives. And this is normal activity.
Are there also measurements for everyday drugs, just like sugar or maybe also social media or whatever? So because I hope at least not everybody at home is taking cocaine or heroin, but certainly sugar or coffee or nicotine.
Right. So that's a really important point, that almost everything in the modern world has become drugified. So not only is it that food with lots of fat, sugar, and salt is releasing a lot of dopamine, but also, I mean, you mentioned nicotine products.
Now, what amounts are we talking about? Is it just a bit, or is it could you actually compare a bowl of French fries with maybe cocaine or something like that?
Yes, you can literally compare a bowl of French fries with cocaine. Now, remember, there's this concept of drug of choice. So one
with ketchup,
person's,
of course. Yeah.
Right, with ketchup.
Yeah.
So one person's cocaine might be another person's French fries. So it's possible to get addicted to food, especially if your particular makeup is that food is your drug of choice, right? So, or maybe it's sex and pornography. Right. So people can get very, very addicted to pornography and compulsive masturbation. Maybe it's video games, right? As I talk about in the book, for me, I got a little bit addicted to romance novels. And the reason that's important is because what really fueled my addiction was my Kindle, my ability to get racier and racier, more pornographic types of novels at the touch of a fingertip. I didn't have to pay very much money. I didn't have to go to the library. I didn't have to hide what I was reading because nobody else could tell. And so over time, I was, because of the access, quantity, potency, I was indulging more and more in this escape into this fantasy world. And I essentially started to manifest, the signs and symptoms of addiction, just like my patients do to drugs. So the point is,
it doesn't seem to be so severe if you do it in a reading way, because I always imagine that the more you need to fantasize in your head, it's not so directly as you would watch it. For example, if you would watch porn or something like that, it might be much more triggering than reading about it. Or is that just me not knowing what's really happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but honestly, it's you not knowing.
Yeah.
I've talked to many, many people with severe sex addiction, and what they will say is that their addiction is even harder because the bar is in their head, right? They don't have to go to a bar and get a drink. The bar is in their head, and you can't escape, very hard to escape your own fantasy life, which is immediately accessible and also hidden to others. So people with severe, sex and love and pornography addiction, it's really, really hard because they have to actually abstain from fantasy as well in order to really get their addiction under control.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I also, one of the questions that also came was were from a teacher who said that it's very hard to compete with computer games, and the children of today are also in the 3D virtual reality worlds all day long. And then in school, it's so boring for them listening to just one person talking about, I don't know, historical facts, and they tend to fall asleep kind of, and because there is no more focus, attention possible for them anymore. What do you say to that? Is that also related? I guess it is related with dopamine, lack of dopamine in this case.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is related. So what happens as we continue to bombard our reward pathway with reinforcing drugs and behaviors, from the moment that we wake up and check our phone, to the coffee and morning cigarette, to our Netflix binge at night and everything in between, is that our brain has to compensate by downregulating dopamine and putting us in that dopamine deficit state with the gremlins on the pain side. And once that happens, modest rewards, everyday rewards, are no longer interesting, right? So even a very engaging teacher is not going to be interesting to a kid who was up all night playing League of Legends video games, right? We can't possibly compete with that. And really, there's a physiologic change. That's one of my main points, is that I think both as individuals and in nations, we're changing our brain physiology and putting ourselves into this dopamine deficit state, which I think is a primary explanation for the rising rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, and overall unhappiness. If you, for example, look at world happiness surveys, people are more unhappy today than they were 30 years ago. And the most unhappy people are people living in rich nations. Likewise, if you look at rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, they've been steadily going up over the past 30 years, and they're highest in the richest nations. So what we have here is a real paradox, that the more we have, the more abundance we have, the more leisure time we have, the more disposable income we have to spend on these leisure goods, the more unhappy we are. And it's not a moral problem, it's a brain problem. There's a physiology here that is driving our misery, which is that we're ending up in this dopamine deficit state.
Fascinating and devastating, kind of.
Yeah.
Is it that you can? Is that just a theory that you have, and okay, I believe you, or is there a manifested? Can you really see that in brain scans or measuring in how scientific is that?
Yeah,
this is the question, because
right.
it seems to me logical what you're telling me. It seems to be, yeah, that is the case, and you could say that, but how scientific is it?
So it's very scientific, and I showed you a brain image that when we continue to stimulate our reward pathway with reinforcing drugs and behaviors, that eventually our brain compensates or adapts by going into this dopamine deficit state. And I showed you a brain image of that, right? And also clinically, I see that all the time. The other aspect of it, where I extrapolate to nations, is my inferential hypothesis, but it's also based on my clinical work, where I see lots of people come in who are anxious, depressed, suicidal. And 20 years ago, the first thing I might have done was prescribe an antidepressant or try some psychotherapy. Now, the first thing that I do is ask them to do a dopamine fast. So essentially abstain from their drug of choice for long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for dopamine homeostasis to be restored. And I've done this experiment now for going on 20 years. And it's really incredible how much better people feel, less depressed, less anxious, more able to be present, better sleep, more motivation, just by stopping their drug of choice, whether their drug is cannabis or alcohol or opioids or pornography or video games or social media, YouTube, Netflix, you name it.
So you say that many people who feel depressed are not too low in dopamine, but too high, maybe. Or how do I get that?
No. They're too low in dopamine, but it's the dopamine deficit state that is similar to depression. But that dopamine deficit state is caused by the constant exposure to high dopamine, right? So remember the teeter-totter, it's the fact that we're ingesting all of these drugs that is causing our brain to release a lot of dopamine at first, right? Tilting to the pleasure side. But remember, the overarching biological law is homeostasis. Our brain wants to remain level. The way our brain remains level is tilting an equal and opposite amount to the whatever the initial stimulus was. So if the initial stimulus is pleasure, our brain will tilt to pain and then go balance. So it's always here, then balance. That's how our brain does it.
The only thing that you didn't have on that balancing board was love. I was thinking about if you're really in a relationship, maybe I was thinking about the how do you call the wedding, the holidays after wedding, how do you call it?
The honeymoon.
Honeymoon, yeah. Maybe this is 2-3 weeks. So this is not that you after 2 days you just fall into a hole and are very depressed. I hope that it lasts longer. Or does this not? Or is this oxytocin and has nothing to do with dopamine status?
Oh no, it does. So we know that oxytocin, the love hormone, binds to dopamine releasing neurons in the reward pathway. So love is a drug. Yeah. But the timeline for the come down is going to be different for different people. For some people, they might fall in love, in a matter of days and then have a come down from that experience, a matter of days later. For most people, it's not like that. For most people, actively being in love can last months and even years. But anybody who's been married for any period of time will tell you that the love changes. It's not that the love goes away, but that sensation of being in love, which is kind of a drugged state, where you only see the good things in your partner and don't see any bad things, that eventually wears off. And then all of a sudden you see this person, as a whole person, and you start to notice their flaws. And whether or not a marriage survives is in part whether or not we can reconcile ourselves to our partner as they appear to us after we are done being in this drugged state of being in love.
So right now I'm high on dopamine. I'm high in love because Dr. Anna Lembke is with me, and I thank you for the first part. And in the second part, we will return and in there try to give you some tips at home and some ideas how you can maybe get a balanced dopamine level in your brain long term. That is, I guess, the idea. Thank you so far.
Yeah, you're welcome.